Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about how representative our government is and how should it be representative of us. One of the most important components of a government is to be a representative of the people who elect them. After all, they are supposed to emulate the voters' will because that's why they were ultimately elected. But there are a lot of challenges toward this end. There are some times that government officials don't represent their constituents well. Could be for any number of reasons. Maybe they just use their office to enrich themselves or elevate their prestige, or they only listen to their campaign donors, or they just aren't effective at getting policy enacted for their constituents, and then they'll get voted out in the next election. But there's another issue that arises in this regard. What exactly should a representative government look like? We all want a government that acts in our interest, that reflects us in some way, that is similar to us in some way. But that could mean a lot of different things. Should their demographics be similar? Their ideology, their partisanship? Should they do every single thing we want, or do we trust them to do the right thing according to their conscience? A lot of questions to answer. And it's easy to say that government should be representative of the people. I think just about all of us can agree on that. But it's a lot harder to say how that government and how that representativeness should manifest and how we get agreement on that. So today, we're going to tackle this topic of representativeness and what it looks like. Let's go. First of all, what is representativeness in government? Sounds like a very obvious question, and in a way it is. But the short answer is it's how much our elected officials reflect their districts that they were elected to and the rest of the people that their government has jurisdiction over. So if we're talking about federal government, how much do members of Congress reflect their districts and the nation? Because yes, you have to reflect and represent the district that elected you, but you are also part of a national body. So you also have to some extent, represent the entire nation. On a somewhat smaller scale, how much do state legislators reflect their districts and their states? So they have to reflect the district that elected them in the state and also the rest of the state at large because they are in that state's legislature. And then similarly, it can be for county commissioners and how much they reflect their districts and their overall county, or city councilors for their district and their overall city. But then there's also not just whether they are representative, but how much people feel like they're being represented by government. So how much do people feel that they are represented by whatever government is in question? Now, obviously, we're going to find that out primarily through polls because you're trying to get public sentiment in this regard. And it partially depends on the government in question. Usually when we ask how satisfied you are with the government, it's typically in the context of Congress, not state or local governments, because polling is expensive and fewer people pay attention to state and local governments, and Congress gets all the attention. So typically people ask pollsters ask people how they feel about Congress. Also, there's 50 different states, so there's 50 different state legislatures, and that's hard to keep track of all of them and public sentiment about all of them. And when pollsters ask people how they feel about Congress, they don't necessarily directly ask the question, do you feel well represented by Congress? Sometimes they do, but they don't always ask that or a similar question. But they do ask other relevant questions like, how much trust do you have in government, or in Congress specifically? Or do you approve of the way Congress is handling its job? And in this regard, polls tend to find low trust and low approval ratings of Congress. Gallup, for example, in February 2026, found 80% disapproval, 80, of the job Congress was doing. And they haven't measured a plurality of approval in this poll since 2004. And then in a separate poll in September 2025, they found 66% of people had not very much trust or no trust at all in the legislative branch. Now, those didn't ask specifically, do you feel well represented by Congress? But if people did feel well represented by Congress, they probably wouldn't be saying those things. They'd probably have a lot more trust in Congress. They probably have a lot more approval of the job Congress is doing. But especially lately, those opinions have been in the tank. So I think it's safe to say that people typically don't feel represented by Congress. And that's also partially affected by the party of the respondent to the poll and which party is in power. When Republicans have control of Congress, Republicans in the electorate are more likely to feel like they're well represented. If Democrats are in power in Congress, then Democrats in the electorate are going to typically feel more represented. But beyond that, let's talk a little bit more of the philosophical, the abstract, the main models of representation. So, the 4 main models of representation. At least 2 basic ideas of how government should represent the people's will exists, and it isn't inherently about partisanship or ideology or anything like that. And I say at least 2 because there are a couple of other models that are proposed by some people, more on that shortly. But the 4 main models, and the first 2 that we're going to deal with, are Delegate and Trustee, and then there's also Politico and Partisan. But it makes sense to discuss Delegate and Trustee first, and I'll show you why. In a delegate model, a political representative acts as a direct mouthpiece for constituents, strictly voting according to their beliefs. And some people call this the instructed model because voters are telling you exactly what they want you to do. And then there's the trustee model, which is where a political representative is entrusted to use their own judgment and knowledge to make the best choice for their constituents. And sometimes this is called uninstructed. You're entrusted to do what is best according to your own conscience. So, which one of these do you like? The delegates or the trustee? Maybe it's the delegate model. Of course, you want a congressperson or a state legislator or whoever to do exactly what you want them to. That's why you voted for them, that you voted for them according to your beliefs. And so it would behoove them to do what you want. Or maybe it's a trustee model, because of course you can't keep up with everything that your representative is doing. There's just too much going on in your life and in Capitol Hill or in your state capital. So these representatives need to use their conscience to do what's best. Well, like every model used in politics, because you're dealing with human beings, both of these models have their shortcomings. So if we look at the delegate model, we're going to go with 4 weaknesses for each of these, for these 2 models here. And in the delegate model, one of the problems is, what constituents do you listen to on a given issue? Because there's going to be some disagreement among them, including people who voted for you. You can't be a delegate for all of them all the time. So Group A and B, let's say they both voted for you, but Group A really likes this one bill you're going to vote on, and Group B doesn't. Well, which one are you going to be a delegate for? Supposedly, both of these groups voted for you to do what they wanted you to do, but you can't do what both of them want you to do in this case because they both have different opinions on this bill. There's also the problem that constituents don't always have the facts on hand because they are not up there in Capitol Hill. They are not always researching this stuff, so they won't always make the best judgment. And some, of course, will just be selfish and just want what benefits them and not necessarily the whole community. Or they might tell themselves that what's best for them is best for the community. And also, if you were to be a delegate, you can't always know what all of your constituents want on every single issue because there's just too many issues for them to follow and for you to get people's opinions on. So that also is a problem for delegates. And then lastly, a delegate has no core convictions of their own. They're just going where the wind takes them. They can be easily swayed. They're just going to simply vote for what gets them elected. Is that somebody who's trustworthy? So all those problems I listed for the delegate model, maybe now you're thinking, well, okay, then I guess the trustee model is the way to go. Not so fast. Let's talk about 4 weaknesses for the trustee model as well. For a trustee, many representatives abuse the trust given to them by constituents, like using their office to enrich themselves, to elevate their prestige, to get more media attention. It's not about doing work for the community. It's about getting on a soapbox and getting all the attention and getting all these hits on podcasts and social media. And there's a lot of those kinds of people we've seen. Maybe we disagree on who those people are, but we've undoubtedly seen a lot of those kinds of people. Also, for a trustee, your constituents did elect you to act in accordance to their wishes to some extent. So at some point, it is expected that you vote based on what your constituents want, not just what you want. So that's a tough balancing act to strike there. And also, trustees can, rightly or wrongly, sometimes this is a proper perception, sometimes it's not, they can be seen as elitist because of this perceived sense of thinking they know better than their constituents about everything. Well, I'm the person that's in government, so I'm just going to vote what my conscience tells me because I know what's going on. You don't. They might be actually thinking that. They might not actually be thinking that. And then lastly, even if they're not being elitist, a trustee's judgment can still be faulty just because they're in office. Oh boy, yeah, definitely just because they're in office does not mean that they're going to make the right decision. And just because they're entrusted by their constituents to make that right decision doesn't mean they always will make that right decision. So because of those shortcomings of both the delegate and trustee model of representation, some people subscribe to what's called the Politico model, which is basically a hybrid of delegate and trustee, where a representative follows the trustee model for the most part, where they're supposed to act on what they think is best, but they will be a delegate on issues that their constituents deeply care about. And so this may sound like the solution. After all, I just showed you some of the flaws of both delegates and trustees. Not so fast. It is not that simple. Again, these are models we're talking about. They describe things in a very simplified manner, but when you're talking about human nature and behavior, things are never so simple. Some of the shortcomings of the Politico model. Now, and the Politico model may be what happens a lot of times in reality, in some cases, but some of the problems with the model include how basically every issue has some people that deeply care about it. So how many people does it have to be that deeply care about it for a representative to turn into a delegate? If we talk about the Iran war, for example, maybe your district doesn't have that many people who care about the Iran war specifically, but there is a group that very, very deeply cares about it. So do you start voting on bills related to it according to those constituents' wishes? What if that group of constituents that deeply cared about the Iran war was bigger? Would you then start to become a delegate instead of a trustee? It's hard to figure out how many voters that needs to be. And even if the Politico model is objectively the right way, can we trust a delegate or a representative to correctly, quote unquote, assume when they should be a trustee versus a delegate? Maybe there's something where they should in quotation marks, they should act as a trustee on a bill when they really should have acted as a delegate, and vice versa. There's no real objective way to determine that. And then politicos can still be seen as calculating and out for their own ambitions because they're just, whether it's rightly or wrongly perceived as this, they might be trying to toe the line just to get themselves elected, where they're trying to do just enough to please their constituents so they get reelected, but also do just enough to please their party leadership so that they can elevate their prestige, so they can get big time committee assignments or run for a higher office. Like if they're in the U.S. House, they might run for U.S. Senator or for the governor of their state, or they might even run for president. And so then that leaves us with the fourth model, the partisan model. And it's just as it sounds. You're just simply voting on party lines. Doesn't matter what the constituents say. A lot of times those constituents will, at least the very, very loud ones, some of them will still want you to vote the party line anyways. And in this era of hyperpolarization, you see a lot more of this happening. But might be obvious why this is a problem. But we're still going to talk about the problems with it anyway, just to lay them out there. So you're only going to increase toxicity and political divides because all you're doing is just voting along the party line. You're not listening to any other criticisms. And guess what? parties are not a monolith. Not every Republican thinks the same way. Not every Democrat thinks the same way. So what if those voters think a different way than the rest of the party thinks? Do you just completely ignore them? Well, in this model, you do. And then that's not to say anything about the fact that you're completely disregarding the other major party. So if it's a Republican district, it's disregarding Democrats. If it's a Democratic district, disregarding Republicans. And then they're both disregarding third parties and no party voters. But they are also your constituents. A lot of people want to act like only the people that voted for them are their constituents. But no, it's everybody in your district is one of your constituents, whether you like that or not. And also, a partisan model can still be calculating and ambitious. Representatives in the partisan model can be calculating and ambitious, especially in staunchly partisan districts, because they're simply following the party line to enrich themselves and elevate their prestige. They don't have to worry about the district voting against them because they've just been going along the party line the whole time, and there's not enough of the opposition in the electorate to vote against that person. So there's nothing really to stop them from doing that. There's no real accountability. So as is the case of all models of anything political, you can't find a perfect one for every scenario, whether it's one that we should follow or one that explains every situation. You're never going to find one like that. But now, moving from the abstract to more of the practical now, what are these different kinds of representativeness that we're talking about? Because there are a bunch of different ways that we can look at this. And different people place different kinds and levels of emphasis on different kinds of representativeness. How many times can I say different in one sentence? So for time's sake, we're just going to focus on 4 different kinds of representativeness. We're going to talk about partisan, ideological, racial, and gender. So first up, partisan representativeness. How much does a party division of Congress or the state legislatures reflect the party divisions of the public? So we can't really answer that question neatly, because even though we can obviously see the party labels of each member of Congress, not every state tracks party affiliation of voters. In fact, only 30 states do that as of August 2025. So we have to use polling data to some extent to see how voters identify themselves. Now, obviously, that target will be moving around a little bit, but that's the best that we can do. If you're going to use those to compare to Congress's partisanship at surface level, Congress's partisanship doesn't look much like the electorate, because a plurality or close to a plurality of voters regularly identify as independents. But the vast majority of partisan elections, which is what Congress is, they're partisan elections, vast majority of them are won by either Democrats or Republicans. You almost never see independents in there. And the couple of handfuls that you see in there right now in the U.S. Senate, they caucus with Democrats. So when you're talking about quote unquote true independence, you don't really see much of those at all anymore, at least not in Congress. But if you take the leanings of independents, so a lot of independents will, if they get prodded enough by pollsters, will say, okay, yeah, I lean Republican. Okay, yeah, I lean Democrat. And a lot of them actually lean harder Democrat or Republican than they care to admit. But then when you start to get those numbers, it starts to look a little bit more like Congress. Now, obviously, how the poll splits across congressional districts compared to, what districts they were polled in, obviously it can make things look a bit different. But to some extent, there is a little bit more representativeness there when you're comparing partisanship divisions in Congress to partisanship divisions in the electorate. But then it gets a bit more complicated when we look at the state legislative level, because there are 50 states that we'd have to talk about, and we can't talk about all of them because there's just not enough time. But some state legislatures' party divisions do align more closely to their electorate, at least in states that track party affiliation. Remember, there's 20 states that don't do that. And in Republican states like Wyoming and Florida, if you compare how many percentage of Republicans in the states legislatures in those two states compared to the number of registered Republicans in the electorate, it does look a little bit more like they do start to look a little bit more similar, although there are a lot of independents in Florida. But again, if you start taking leanings of towards Democrats or Republicans, it could start to look more like the partisanship you see in government. But then on the flip side, Democratic states where percentage of Democrats is similar in the electorate is similar to the percentage of Democrats in the state legislature are ones like New York and Maryland. Again, these are not perfect alignments, not perfect comparisons, but they do start to look a little bit more representative in terms of partisanship. And then other state legislatures aren't so partisanly similar to their electorates either, or at least it's hard to see how partisanly similar because of whether independents in those states lean one way or another. But Colorado has a huge plurality of independents, and it's almost a majority. And in Massachusetts does have a majority of independents, but neither of those states have many independent legislators. I think there's a couple of them in Massachusetts, possibly, and I don't think there's any in Colorado. But a lot of independent voters, but very few independent legislators. And I'm not entirely sure if those voters, how many of those voters lean Democrat or Republican, but I suspect a lot more of them tend to lean Democratic based on those states' overall partisan leanings. And then for a local level, that's too hard to really tell and give a case study on, at least here, because there are so many local governments and many are officially nonpartisan offices. So that would take a monumental amount of research, and it might not even be a question you could answer. Some local places you could, but you would have to spend a lot of time researching that. So the second kind of representativeness we'll talk about is ideological representativeness. How much does the ideological makeup of Congress or the state legislatures reflect the ideological divisions in the public? Again, I've said this on previous episodes, you cannot use party interchangeably with ideology. Yes, Republicans tend to be conservative. Yes, Democrats tend to be liberal, but they are not the exact same thing. Some Republicans would not call themselves conservative. Some wouldn't even call themselves liberal. You'd be surprised. Democrats, likewise, you'd be surprised how some of them call themselves conservative, or at least not liberal. Those numbers are dwindling. But again, you cannot just use party and ideology interchangeably. Even though Congress and many state legislatures have become more ideologically divided, and voters have to some extent too. But we overestimate the level of ideological division because it is the most extreme voices that get most of the attention. So we start to think that, oh, wow, everybody's ideologically polarized. Well, no, it's just a lot of loud people. But also the elites or elected officials are much more ideologically inclined than the general public. A lot of the general public, you might be surprised to find, does not care about ideology. They care about party, but they don't care about the ideology, or they don't think in those terms. Or they just use party and ideology interchangeably. But more ideological voters, tend to vote at higher rates than the less ideological and non-ideological voters do. So that's why the public can be less ideologically polarized, while Congress or some state legislatures can be much more ideologically polarized. And so more state governments are becoming more ideologically uniform as well, though it still varies because some state versions of the Democratic Party are less liberal than the national, and some state versions of the Republican Party are less conservative than their national counterpart. But again, the impact of the more heavily ideological voters is pronounced in these elections, probably even more so at the state level than the federal level, because there are generally fewer voters that care about state politics versus federal politics, except for maybe like governor. And so the impact of ideological voters can be even more pronounced there. Third type of representativeness we'll talk about is racial representativeness. So it's no secret that the racial makeup of Congress is less diverse than the general public's racial makeup. But that being said, the beginning of the current Congress, which is the 119th, is the most racially diverse we've had. At the moment, I can't think of any from the start of Congress who have resigned or passed away, so it might still be the same number as at the beginning, but 139 total U.S. senators and representatives identify as at least one racial minority in the current Congress. So 66 Black members of Congress, 53 are Hispanic, 21 are Asian American, and 4 are Native American. And then there are 5 that are multiracial House representatives. None of those in the U.S. Senate, at least not yet. And then states are going to vary considerably in this regard, and there's too many to cover in this episode, but you have seen some state legislatures that have been breaking records of racial minority representation in their respective states as well. And then lastly, gender representativeness has somewhat of a similar dynamic to racial representativeness. Women make up a little more than 50% of the U.S. population, but are not even close to that in Congress. They're something like 28 to 29%. Because at the beginning of the 119th Congress, 150 members of Congress were women, which was almost the highest we've had in history. And then that's not even including U.S. Senator Ashley Moody from Florida, my state, who would join this group later because she was appointed to Marco Rubio's old seat when then he became Secretary of State. And so that was, with her, I believe that was it was one less than the highest number of women that we've had in Congress, which was 152, and that followed a series of special elections in 2024. So not quite at the beginning of that Congress, but later on during that term. And once again, states are going to vary considerably in this regard. There are too many to cover in this episode, but women have started to make up more of state legislatures as well, and some of them have been pushing or breaking records. Now, all this talk about representativeness, we have to talk about challenges to representation, because regardless of your politics, basically everybody can agree that there are some challenges to representativeness in government, whether it's Congress or state legislatures. Now, some people might think that there's not a problem, but even if they aren't necessarily problems now, they can be problems in the future. Whatever model of representation you subscribe to, so if you're the delegate model, the trustee, the Politico, the partisan, there are many hindrances to having a government that emulates the interests of the people. And unfortunately, there are no easy answers to fixing them. But we're going to talk about a handful of the most pressing challenges that representativeness in government faces. So, first up, low turnout in elections. Among democracies in the world, the U.S. typically ranks pretty low in voter turnout, and it's been this way for some time. Even in presidential elections, you don't see necessarily that many people vote. And now, turnout rates can be calculated in different ways. Some people will calculate voter turnout based on voting age population, because obviously not everybody in the population can vote. Some people will use the voting eligible population, which is another subset of the voting age population, because not everybody who is of the age to vote is registered to vote. And then some people will use registered voters instead of the voting eligible population, because not everybody who's eligible to vote is registered to vote. And so the voter turnout rate can fluctuate depending on that. We've talked about it in a couple episodes of the podcast. But in any case, however you cut it, voter turnout rates in the U.S. aren't exactly anything to write home about. They're some of the lowest in the world. And then turnout gets worse when it's not a presidential election. So presidential elections get the highest turnout rates. Midterms drop a lot more. Past that, they might be as low as 15 to 20 to 25 percentage points lower than what you get in presidential elections, maybe even more. Odd year elections, ones that are specifically set for odd year elections, those can be even lower. So like a 2021, 2023, 2025, 2027 next year. And then you get to special elections, which are inherently irregularly timed because you have to come up with a date for them. So those tend to see even lower turnout rates. And then you can also look at it from federal to state to local level races. Federal government tends to see the highest turnout rates. State executives like a governor or attorney general will see maybe something a little bit similar to like Congress, for example. And then other state level races like state legislators and state judges, those will have even lower turnout. And then local level races will, generally speaking, they have putrid turnout. You might see as little as 10, 15, 20, 25% of voters that can vote in their local government's elections. That's all of them that will vote. So lots of problems with low turnout rates in elections. But why does that pose a threat to representativeness? If they just chose not to vote, then, I mean, that's their decision, right? Well, yes, to some extent it is. But low turnout is a problem for representation because by definition, it means fewer people are making their voice heard. Democracy needs people to participate in it in order to legitimize it. If you're not having enough people participate, then really what is the point of having things being voted on? There's not really much of a point to doing that. And you can't possibly be representative in full of your population because we aren't even hearing from nearly all of the eligible voters that could make their voice heard. We're not even hearing about them. So you hear things like, oh, half the nation voted for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And no, that's not true. First of all, they almost never get a majority. Well, I don't want to say almost never, but a lot of times they only get a plurality because there are people that vote for a third party candidate or they vote for a write-in. But also, it's not even counting the people who didn't make their voice heard. Who were they going to vote for? Were they going to vote for Donald Trump? Were they going to vote for Joe Biden? Were they going to vote third party or a write-in? Would they have just left the presidential election blank and voted on other races on their ballot? We don't know. They didn't make their voice heard. So it's not even half of people that could vote that are choosing an elected official. It's more like, or a president, it's more like 35, 40% of the electorate, maybe, are choosing the president of the United States. And then you'll see sometimes even similar numbers for like a governor of a state, or you might see even fewer people. Remember those lower voter turnout rates, the lower in government that you get, or the lower of a level of government that you get. So you're really only having a small subset of people choose their elected officials because so many people are not participating. That can't possibly be representative. Challenge number 2 to representativeness in government is hurdles in ballot access laws. So ballot access simply means how people get on the ballot. There's a whole bunch of different laws depending on where you're running and for what office you're running for that dictate how you can get on the ballot. But typically, there's 2 ways to get on the ballot. You either pay a fee or you get a certain number of petitions signed to put you on the ballot instead. But here's the kicker. The vast majority of third party and no party candidates often face a much tougher time getting on the ballot than Democrats and Republicans do. And not because they don't get attention or they don't have enough money. I mean, that's part of it too. But a lot of times they often have no option to pay a filing fee. And the number of petitions they need is often considerably higher than their Democratic or Republican opponents need. Now, this is not arguing that we should or shouldn't have more independent election winners. I'm just simply stating the reality of uneven ballot access laws. They are considerably tougher for independent candidates than they are for Democrats and Republicans. Though, some Democrats and Republicans have their own hurdles, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But why do these hurdles in ballot access limit representativeness? We don't want a whole bunch of people running for office that we can't keep track of all of them, right? Well, it's a hurdle that's based on trying to limit party competition, not about trying to make elections more efficient or simplified. Sometimes that's the argument that's used, or there's an argument about the right to association with the parties, and some people are not actually associating with a party, or they say, oh, well, because these third parties are so small, they shouldn't get the same kinds of benefits in law that Republicans and Democrats get. Whatever the case may be, a lot of these arguments are really just trying to limit the pool of competitors to the Republicans and Democrats. Because if there's one thing that those two parties can agree on, it's that they don't want more competition. But again, I'm not saying we should have more independence. I just have a strong opinion about the need for competitiveness in our elections. And there are also a ton of voters who are independents and what you might call, quote unquote, soft Democrats and Republicans. And they're not actually soft. It's just that they don't identify as strongly with their party. And they might want a third candidate, but they can't vote for that kind of candidate if that candidate doesn't even run or doesn't get their name out there. So you are effectively shutting out those people who want to make their voice heard. And so they will have to just toe the line of what the parties want, whether that party is even competitive in that district or not. Sometimes a local Democratic Party is so dwarfed by the Republican Party there, or the local Republican Party is so dwarfed by the Democrat there, but they still are very rigid in what they want, and their respective constituent bases will just have to deal with it because they don't have any other choices to go between, which is a good lead up to this next issue for representativeness. And this is actually talking about the two major parties this time. Litmus tests for Democrats and Republicans and excessive partisanship, because even some Democrats and Republicans have a tough time running for office, but of course for different reasons typically than independents do. The parties often have favored people in mind, or at least people they don't want to run, and that they work to give certain candidates an easier time towards the nomination. They might give more resources to those candidates, even if they publicly say, they don't endorse a candidate. Sometimes they will publicly endorse a candidate, sometimes they won't, but they will still funnel resources towards them. And of course, these people who run these local and state parties have their own opinions about who would be the best candidate. And primaries also tend to see more rigidly partisan and ideological voters participating than in the general election. Some people just don't care about the primaries and say, okay, just let me know when they get selected and then I'll come out in November. But because they do that, you let more ideological and partisan voters dictate who's getting to the general election in the first place. So a Democrat or a Republican that, quote unquote, steps out of line because they didn't do every single thing that the party wanted, they're going to have a tougher time getting support. And they're just going to be also rans. Excuse me. That's the word I was looking for. But why do these litmus tests pose a threat to representativeness? Well, just said it. They treat parties like they should be monoliths, subject to groupthink, and there should not be exceptions to the rule. We shouldn't hear their voices. You have to just deal with the party line or go join the other party or go move somewhere else. And it also increases partisan polarization because candidates have to fit into a certain mold. So the overall parties will then become even less representative because there are more and more of these kinds of candidates that are taking office. So fewer and fewer people feel represented by government, and more of them are becoming disenchanted. Next major roadblock to representativeness is gerrymandering. And this can get a little bit tricky, and I'll tell you one reason why in particular in a minute. But of course, gerrymandering is you're picking and choosing where to place voters to deliberately give you and your party the greatest electoral benefit. Now, sometimes these are very obvious with weirdly drawn lines. You'll look at a congressional map and it's just this very weird squiggle, and you're like, there's no way that can be legal. And sometimes it won't be legal. Sometimes a court will rule it unconstitutional. But then other times, the gerrymandering is a little bit more surreptitious, a little bit harder to find. And gerrymandering attempts have generally gotten more clever over time, but so have methods for catching it and trying to prevent it. And of course, currently, both parties right now are trying to redraw lines in states that they firmly have a grip on to consolidate their majorities and then make up excuses for why they're justified in that regard. Both parties, yes. But there is one aspect to these redrawing of lines that is controversial and doesn't really have an easy answer. Yes, generally speaking, gerrymandering is clearly unfair, but there is a little bit of a gray area when it comes to these majority minority districts. So these are districts where a majority of the district's voters are at least one racial minority. Maybe it's a predominantly black district or a predominantly Hispanic district. So these districts make it much more likely that a racial minority gets elected and that they have some level of representation in Congress or in the state legislature. But why would these be controversial? Well, some people think that having a seat that's basically guaranteed to a racial minority is an unfair act of racial gerrymandering. But not every racial minority supports these kinds of districts either, because some of them think that this helps to prevent what's called cracking, which is you take a specific segment of the population, you try to spread them out across multiple districts so you completely dilute their power and their influence so that they can't really get a foothold anywhere. And the idea behind these majority minority districts is saying, well, let's not split up these minority voters because then they're not going to be able to get anybody to represent them because their power is diffused across a whole bunch of districts. But some racial minorities all think instead of empowering their communities, it actually does what's called packing, which is a different kind of gerrymandering where you put the entire community you're trying to dilute the power of into one whole place. So you can say, okay, fine, we'll just give up on this one, maybe 2 or 3 seats, but we will consolidate our power even more or give ourselves an even better chance in all these other districts. So they basically lost these particular battles, but they're going to win the war, so to speak. And so some people will say that instead of empowering these minorities, it'll actually limit how much influence they can have in Congress or in state legislatures, because it says, well, maybe these voters, if they weren't packed into one district, they could actually get more than one person from their community elected. They might be able to get like a handful of them elected. So it's really not a consensus one way or another amongst racial minority activists and candidates as to whether these districts are beneficial to their communities or not. But regardless of whether you support or oppose these kinds of districts, it does pose a lot of important questions for representativeness. Now, those kinds of districts aside, in most cases, gerrymandering obviously hinders representativeness because you're trying to rig elections in favor of you or your party. Doesn't get much more unrepresentative when you try that because you're not actually trying to represent everybody in your district. You're trying to pick the people you want to represent so that you can get yourself in office. And then the last hurdle to cover that is an obstacle to representativeness in government: large average population per congressional district, and to some extent, state legislative districts. Back in episode 60 of this podcast, I explored an idea for reform that a lot of people have suggested, which was to expand the number of representatives in the U.S. House. The idea was basically there's too many people per district. If we add more people to Congress, we can have a lot fewer people per district, and then you could actually have them be able to listen to everybody. Because the U.S. House has been fixed at 435 members since a congressional act back in 1929. So it's been almost 100 years now that it's been set legally in stone, but it's been 435 longer than that. And the average population of a congressional district following the 2020 census was about 761,000 people. And that's a huge jump from 2010, which was about 711,000 people per district. And then in 2000, it was about 647,000 people per district. So these districts are just getting far bigger in a short span of time. And some of these state legislative districts have a similar problem as well, although they're a little bit more able to address those problems specifically. You see state legislatures change the number of legislators they have a little bit more often than you do in Congress. But why would these large populations per district pose a threat to representativeness? Well, legislators can't possibly reach out to everyone in their districts. Think about trying to contact, now, obviously, not all of them are going to be registered voters or voting age population or anything like that. But let's just say you have 761,000 people in your district and maybe 550,000 are voting age population, and then, I don't know, 500,000 of them are registered voters. 500,000 people that you have to reach out to. And even if you just want to reach out just to your own party, that's still a ton of people that you have to reach out to. You can't possibly talk to all of them and hear everybody's concerns. And even though not everybody is looking to contact their member of Congress, even if they generally support that member of Congress, they're not necessarily trying to always contact them, enough people will try to get a hold of their member of Congress that it's basically impossible for that member of Congress and their staffs to hear all of those constituents. And then for state legislators who have lower compensation than Congress does, smaller staffs, fewer resources to tackle this problem of reaching out to constituents, this problem is pronounced even more. You can't possibly represent all these people no matter how hard you try to, because there's just too many of them. And the population is only going to get larger, so the problem is only going to get bigger. Now, I'm not trying to necessarily say that I agree or disagree with this idea of expanding the U.S. House, but it is something that does need to be addressed. It is a very big problem that we are facing right now for representation in government. And speaking of which, it's a really good segue into this final point about the future of the representativeness in government. Just a few final thoughts here. And I think it behooves me to talk about, there's a certain level of arrogance that some people have, that they think they speak for the American people. Always be aware of people who act like they speak for the American people, or at least be skeptical of them, because there's so many talking heads on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, One America. I know I used those specific examples, but there are a lot more examples than that. So many of these talking heads on these places that they like to say things like, oh, well, the American people want blah, blah, blah. The American people are tired of blah, blah, blah. And really, it's just a thinly veiled partisan or ideological statement. It's not actually anything that's born from polling. And even if it is born from polling, saying like 54% of people or 55% of people or whatever that agree with this thing, and saying that, extrapolating that to the entire American population, is absurd. But America is a very eclectic population with many different policy views, as it should be. We keep treating, we really just want to treat things as monoliths when they're not. There's a whole lot more variety to people than we want to give them credit for. Now, the core of what people want is largely the same, though, and that's something we should be more cognizant of. Things like the importance of respect. They want a good economy. They want safety. They want freedom, and so on. This is what these supposed proclamations of what Americans want should actually focus on, not these polarized or politicized statements that you hear. So this drives me crazy, just to bring this back to the whole idea of representativeness. A lot of these people think that they themselves represent America. No, they represent their own slice of America that they want to listen to, and they don't try to listen to anybody else. And that is a very big problem that we have in this nation. You can't just not listen to other people and try to act like you're representing everybody, that you're being a true representative of your government or of your population, no matter how heavy that district leans towards one party or another. You're never going to be truly representative of your district. And so when we talk about how to improve representativeness in our government, because I think most of us can agree that we should be improving our representativeness in government, the problem is, again, how do we do that? So some of the questions to ask ourselves is which types of representativeness are important. We talked about partisan and ideological and racial and gender. And some people didn't even get to talk about this one. They really care about the career backgrounds of Congress. Back in the day, used to be the vast majority of them were lawyers or they were in public service already. Today, you have a wide range of occupational backgrounds of these legislators in Congress and state legislatures. Things like teachers and firefighters, police officers, activists, musicians, actors, all sorts of different kinds of candidates from all sorts of different backgrounds. A lot of people also care about that kind of representativeness because they want people who have lived similar experiences to them. Military veterans has always been a very popular choice as well, not just recently, but even back in the day. So a lot of times it was just military veterans and and existing politicians and lawyers way back when, but now you see a lot more kinds of people. So which of these types of representativeness are important and how important should they be? Because there's some that we're going to place more of an emphasis on than others. But then how should we incentivize these kinds of representativeness? We can't force them. You can't force a law that says the partisan makeup, the ideological makeup, the racial, gender, career makeup, whatever, needs to be exactly like the rest of the population that they represent. So Congress needs to look like the nation. Each state needs to look like the state's electorate. You can't force that. But is there some way that you can incentivize it? Maybe we need to find more varied candidates to run for public office. There are a lot of groups that work towards that end. So it's one thing to say that we need to be more representative, but how do we make that happen and how should we incentivize it without trying to brute force it? Because if you try to brute force it, a lot of people are going to push back on that. And then lastly, because sometimes people like to poo-poo other people that have different political views on them for all sorts of different things, but even if people aren't necessarily quote unquote right about not feeling represented, if you think that their arguments are unjustified or whatever, the fact that they still feel that way matters because is a lot of disenchantment and disengagement and lack of feeling represented by government that we see today. A lot of disaffected people. People not feeling like government is listening to them will, and has led to lashing out against government and other citizens in violent manners. And it's happening more and more often. And it's getting a lot more attention. You talk about, for example, what happened with Charlie Kirk on the Republican side, or on the Democratic side, Melissa Hortman. Those might not have necessarily been directly tied to not feeling represented, but it's something that does happen from people who don't feel represented. They don't feel like the government listens to them. How many times have people tried to, make a statement basically? Now, of course, obviously that doesn't mean that their actions are correct, that they're justified. Violence is never justified. But if you let these feelings of not feeling representative fester, it could lead to more and more situations like that. And even though you might feel represented by government, there's always going to be somebody who doesn't. And they might have a point. Maybe they don't ever get to feel like government is ever listening to them. And sometimes they might be right. Just because you win an election doesn't mean you don't owe anything to the losers of the election. A lot of times people feel like they don't owe anything to the losers in an election. But if we constantly feel like that, we're just going to keep dealing retribution to each other whenever the pendulum swings and the quote unquote other side wins. Then they're going to try to exact vengeance on other people for not listening to them. And then it's just going to keep going back and forth, back and forth. And that's not how you get a representative government. So, of course, obviously, a lot of this starts with our government specifically. because they're the ones who ultimately have to be more representative of us and not care about their own careers. But that's a lot easier said than done. There is some level of responsibility that we as voters have to take as well. We have to make government be more representative of us. Again, not through violent means, through peaceful, legal, electoral means. And we also have to be willing to not be so obsessed with this twisted notion we have of winning, where we have to win everything at all costs. That also hinders representativeness of government, because we're going to feel like we're being represented, but there's a large chunk of the population that's not going to feel that way. And when you see much more cooperation between people and everybody feels like they're getting a little bit of something out of this, you're going to see a lot more people feel represented, and you're going to see a lot more of a responsive government, a lot more of a representative government. And that's going to end things here for the podcast for today's episode. Thank you all so much for listening. Please like, comment, share, subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. And then if this expands out to other places in the future, please spread the word about this podcast and what it's trying to do, trying to take a different route on all these political topics and give a unique angle to things, try to touch on things in a manner that people may not have thought of, and in as impartial a manner as I try to be as impartial as I can. Can't ever be fully 100% impartial, but certainly try to be as unbiased as possible. So thank you so much for listening. My links in the show notes: Facebook, LinkedIn, medium.com. I'm going to start writing on Substack soon. Websites, paulrader.org, my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com, and my 5-day educational email course about how to more effectively tackle and decrease polarization in this country, because a lot of the ways that we try to decrease polarization is not only ineffective, but sometimes has the opposite effect. So please check that out. it's free, just a little sign up for 5 days. And that is, I believe, everything. So thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.